What I want to talk about is what life was like in the late Middle Ages by kind of running through a who's who. Not entirely. Hello. Come on over. Otherwise you won't be able to hear me. Sorry, I've just gotten over a cold and my voice is still.
You're fine.
I'm a wolf dog. It may seem like going through a who's who for the Middle Ages be like names and dates and boring and dusty history, but if I asked you the most influential leaders of the 20th century, who would you say? Roosevelt, King George, Kaiser Wilhelm, Lenin, Churchill, FDR, Stalin, Eisenhower, Mao, Khrushchev, Gandhi, Nixon, Gorbachev, Reagan. Those people kind of created a landscape around which history played out. Not necessarily the great man affiliate history. People stand on the shoulders of giants, and if one person is not there, another will take a similar place. But they still created a narrative around which history played out. And knowing these people and what they did and what they wanted and who they fought to get it, you can kind of understand the flavor of the time period that we're reenacting. So that's what I want to do for the late Middle Ages. We'll start the story at the end of the High Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages are well represented in the Crusades, that romantic orphan period loved by Victorians, but not by us because it's hard to document. The art was iffy. Most of the really cool physical culture was either created beforehand or created after. But the Victorians loved the deeds of history. There were big actions in the High Middle Ages. And at the end of the 13th century, the glory of that age was in a stately but inevitable decline. The Normans were finished when Philip Augustus of France took Normandy away from the Plantagenets. Henry Plantagenet, Henry II, was he not? I think he was the second. Henry Fitzimbrus, married to Eleanor of Aquitaine. By the end of his life, he'd alienated his sons, his wife, his liege lord, and tried to take on the whole damn world by himself. And of course, he lost. And that loss, when he had to permanently relinquish the claim to Normandy to the French crown, was the first nail in the coffin of Normans as a distinct people group and an international power. The Crusader states were a Norman conquest. They were lost to the Seljuk Turks. The Normans had fought well against the Saracens 100 years earlier, but the Mongol horde displaced the Turks, and so they moved south and west. And they, in turn, displaced the Ayyubid Empire and very quickly dominated the region. Frederick II, Emperor of Germany, Stupor Mundi, he actually went on crusade and he reconquered Jerusalem, and they held it for another 20 years, but it fell again, and Antioch was the last to fall. By 1290, it was all gone. The Latin Empire had come and gone, so the Venetians had convinced the Crusaders to sack Constantinople, who was the Venetians' primary naval and economic rival, and put a Catholic emperor on the throne. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but it was a monstrous failure. They were attacked on all sides by Orthodox rebels at home, Bulgarians in the west, north and west, Egyptian coastal raiders, and Eastern Roman Imperials in Asia Minor. 50 years later, when the city had fallen to a tenth of its previous population, Michael Paleologos, who was the most noble man in Greece, convinced the Genoans, who were the Venetians' other naval rival, to support him in retaking the city, and he did. He and his son rebuilt, started the Paleologos imperial line, but Constantinople never fully recovered because in the intervening years the Turks had invaded, and they conquered the economic base in Asia Minor. was swollen to the greatest extent that it would ever reach since Charlemagne started in the first place. It was deflated, shot full of holes by competing interests and angry popes. Where Frederick Stupermundi was powerful enough to conquer Italy, reconquer Jerusalem, defy two popes, shrug off excommunication twice, had a harem of 4 wives and 7 known mistresses. He also had 20 children, and their competition pulled the empire apart at the seams.
How many children?
20. 20 sons.
I thought it was 200. Sorry, really?
And when they were tightening the pieces, the Pope and the landed German hawk idol, the high nobles, cheered them on. They were perfectly happy to do without an emperor for 20 years. And when an emperor was finally crowned, the empire was weak, with little prestige or power. The man they settled on was Heinrich VII. He was a young Count of Luxembourg, who was a compromise candidate. He was a small fish in very deep waters, but he was vigorous, politically savvy, and he maneuvered quite a few of the big fish into rebuilding Frederick II's dream. He campaigned in Italy, which by that time was a vicious cesspool of spies, poisoners, and blood feuds. Italy was divided into the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. That had been relevant, it meant something 150 years ago, but by that time, it said where you lived and whether or not you were going to stab him in the chest or back. When Heinrich came in, he was an almost messianic figure. He threw out the ruling Italian nobles. He treated both factions with respect, which was a surprise. And he restored imperial rule. It would never have lasted. It couldn't have. But no one got to find out because he died of malaria 3 years into his reign, and the empire slowly fell into shambles again. Dante wrote about him in the Divine Comedy and talked about the golden throne that awaited him for his good works. He was the prophet who came to save Italy before she was ready.
Sounds good.
Yeah. In the rest of Europe, we had similar stories. Simon de Montfort was a famous crusader and the brother-in-law of English king. What was that English king? Father of Edward Longshanks, the son of King John, but I don't remember which king that was. Anyway, he was the brother-in-law of the English king. He led a popular uprising in England to restore the protections guaranteed by the Magna Carta and to end royal abuses. If he succeeded, and he was close, England would have been the first constitutional monarchy in Europe. But he was fighting against his nephew, Edward Longshanks, same guy from Braveheart, same guy who utterly conquered Wales, and Longshanks won. Actually, there was a movement at the time to have Simon de Montfort named a saint, and he is considered a folk saint in England. But because he was a rebel against a sitting Catholic king, that never happened. And then, of course, England became Protestant. But now, with the resurgence of the Catholic faith in England, it's entirely possible that the Holy See will actually look at Simon de Montfort again and consider sainthood. Anyway, that's an aside. All throughout the High Middle Ages, Europe had peace, or at least greatness within its grasp, and then it just kind of fumbled it. Had peace and then put it away again. Screw peace. So, what is the defining cutoff between the High Middle Ages and the Late Middle Ages? Well, that was when the Lamb opened the 7 seals and sent down the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Started with the Black Horse. 1315, 2 years after Emperor Henrik died, 20 years after the fall of Jerusalem, Europe experienced unusually heavy rainfall. Throughout the spring and summer, it continued to rain. The temperature remained cool. That led to crop failures. There was no fodder for the livestock because hay couldn't be cured in the rain. The price of food began to rise. Food prices in England doubled between spring and midsummer. By winter, food was 3 times as expensive, or more. Now, winter was unusually harsh. Emergency stores were eaten. It was bad. This was the end of the medieval warm period and the beginning of the Little Ice Age. Next year, the rains kept coming. People existed on seeds and roots. Everything on 4 legs had already been eaten: cows, pigs, horses, oxen, dogs, cats, rats, frogs, mice. Edward II, the King of England, stopped at St. Albans in August, and no bread could be found for the king. There was nothing. Nobody had anything left. Society completely broke down. Like, you think about preparing for the zombie apocalypse. It was kind of fun a couple of years ago. Try preparing for this. People turned to banditry in mass numbers because anybody who had anything had more than you did. And if you didn't have anything, well, people are made of meat. It was so bad, grandparents voluntarily stopped eating so that their grandchildren could survive. And when they died, their own children ate them. Parents abandoned their children. Like, remember the story of Hansel and Gretel?
Mm-hmm.
Parents send their children to the woods, plot to run away, and they come back so that the parents will have something to eat. Then the wicked witch tempts the children in with food so she can fatten them up and eat them herself. That happened. That was real. This was the Great Famine. 10% of the total population died of starvation. In cities, it was more like 25%. Italy and Greece were spared as it happened. The crops never failed because the Alps and the Carpathians stopped the rainfall coming down from the north. The bad reputation of Italians and also Greeks comes from right here because the merchant princes of Italy in later periods, the seeds of their fortune was started right here. They were taking Mediterranean grain and selling it into Northern Europe for 10 times the price or more. And they made fortunes. And enemies. Like, you wonder why nobody in the late period raised a finger to help the Orthodox Christians against the Muslim invaders. This was why. Because they saw them as backstabbing usurers who turned their back on their Christian responsibilities and watched as Europe starved, and so screw those guys. A grudge lasted for generations. Great Famine lasted for 2 years, but the starvation lingered on for at least 5. It took 15 years for food production to return to normal. It took 20 years for the population to return to its previous level. Then came the pale horse, death. 10 years after the recovery from the famine, grain shipments from Crimea landed in Genoa and Messina, Sicily. And rats carrying fleas infected with Yersinia pestis arrived in Central Europe. In a decade, the Black Plague would kill a quarter of the population, again 30 to 60% in cities. And then the Red Horse War. 100 Years' War. When, I do not remember the name of the king who died, but when a French king died without heir, it led to a succession crisis because Edward I, the son of, what's his name, Matilda? No, Matilda is wrong. The she-wolf of France, but I forgot her name. If you all see Braveheart, the movie, the later female lead played by, like, what's her name, like Olivia de Warbo? No, not her. But anyway, the later female lead, that woman, was known as the she-wolf of France. Although she was romanticized in Braveheart, in reality she was, well, history does not remember her kindly. But she bore Edward Longshanks first says, no, it should go to me. And the French said, I don't want to have anything to do with some English barbarian in France. Now, they claimed that France had always had the doctrine of inheritance through the male line solely, but that's not true. That was something that they formalized then. It was tradition. It was tradition everywhere. But when there are emergencies, of course inheritance will pass through the female line. But that was something that France formalized specifically at that time to deny the throne to Edward I. And so Edward I pressed his claim. Excuse me, not Edward I, Edward III. First, not Longshanks. It was Longshanks' son who married the she-wolf of France. And then that man was Edward III. Excuse me, we're a couple decades off. And Edward III pressed his claim with the sword. And they did surprisingly well. But it was a brutal war made brutal by the brutality of the age. Like, you think about it, if you were in the 1350s, if you were an adult man, you would have lived through the plague. You would have been born in an era of famine. And then you come to adulthood in an era of war. This was not war as it was fought in the 13th century. They still held to chivalric ideals. They held to them very tightly. But the way, even the authors, the way that the authors talk about war is very different. Like, if you read Reinhold who was a knight in the 13th century, if you compare what he wrote to Geoffrey de Charny, who was perhaps the greatest knight of the 100 Years' War on the French side, if you compare what they said about war, very different. Reinhold would talk about chivalry, he would talk about the responsibility of your spiritual development. De Charny was talking about practicality. Yes, he was talking about chivalry too, but he was talking about getting results done. And so the war was unpleasant. There's no way that tiny England could overwhelm massive France, so they didn't try. The English army concentrated and hit the French where they weren't. They performed the chevauchée. There were a couple of lopsided upset battles, which we remember today. Like, we remember today because we're Anglophones. We like English history because we can read it. But like, there were some big upsets, which everyone at the time considered miraculous. Not the French. The French refer to the English as the goddams. In general, the English decimated the French countryside. It's like the MacArthur plan, hit them where they ain't. Because when the French were en masse, they were unconquerable for all intents and purposes. So that's not what the English did. They spread out, they ravaged the countryside, and they left the peasants with nothing. And so the peasants would then revolt against the people who were trying to take what they didn't have from them, being their feudal overlords to whom they owed taxes that needed to be paid because those people needed to fight the English. So the French gentry were dispersed, putting down rebellions and upset over their lands, or they were staying in their lands to defend their lands. And that allowed the English to concentrate and hit the French, who were dispersed, and win. The French fought back in essentially guerrilla warfare. I do not remember the name of the Constable of France. Shoot, and I should. It's on the tip of my tongue. Regardless, the knight who became the Constable of France was well known for being a thug. He was not the chivalric ideal of a gentleman. He was somebody who was getting results done. He would dress up as a peasant, wait for the chevalier to come along with many of his men, and they would have like wagons of woodcutters, and then they would start laying about with farm tools, knocking the English off of their horses so that they were no longer mobile and they'd be swarmed and killed and torn apart. It was brutal in a way that warfare a century previous was not. Like there was a scene in François' Chronicles. It was after Poitiers, the Battle of Poitiers. And they talked about the young knights who were at their first battle. They had fought well, but after the battle, they were not prepared to see bodies being stripped and naked bodies being flung into a pile, and prisoners being executed, wounded men being finished off the dagger of the eye slot, and all of their worldly possessions stripped. And it was awful. And so they congregated off to one side and they didn't look at it. And then an older knight rode up to them and said, "Are ye maidens?" He said, "Look well upon the stricken field, for this is the face of all defeat." And in one sense, this is exactly what an elder knight needs to do, to educate the younger generation about the realities of warfare. But on the other hand, the way that they were thinking about it was very different because of they had lived through the apocalypse. What happens when you live through the apocalypse? Society changes. Depression. There's an awful lot of that. A lot of depression. But then people deal with that. They even deal with depression, but to deal with the horrors of a fallen world in essentially two ways. The first is religious fanaticism. Now, Europe is no stranger to religious fanaticism. At the turn of the millennium, there was a great deal of flagellants. They arose at that time. These were people who were beating themselves, whips, or bashing their heads with wooden boards. I mean, have you seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail? I don't remember what. Yes, well, that was real. It was played up humorously in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, but like that was real. People were damaging the flesh so that the spirit would strengthen and be purified.
Self-flagellation, isn't it?
Yes, it was. And so the idea was that they were purifying themselves for the coming apocalypse, which of course did not happen. And in most part, the elders of the church were saying, "Guys, no man shall know the day or the hour. What are you doing?" But so that was religious fanaticism at the turn of the millennium. People were preparing themselves. This was religious fanaticism of a very different kind, because disaster was poured out upon the whole world. Plague, disease, and famine cared nothing for the rich or for the poor. All were affected equally. Therefore, all must have been equally sinful. And so the religious fanaticism that results out of that is one of skepticism, self-justification, criticism of the authority of the church and the authority of nobility. These were really the seed stones of doubt that would sprout 100 years later, more than that, 200 years later, in the Protestant Reformation. This was a questioning of the authority of the church, a questioning of the legitimacy of nobility, because the way that it looked to average people was that God had weighed and measured the elite of Europe and found them all wanting and punished Europe as a whole. And so the fanaticism took on an edge. I keep saying fanaticism, that's not right. Rigor, religious rigor, which could become fanaticism, but it's not inappropriate to say that everyone who was rigorous and spiritually activated by these disasters was a fanatic. They weren't. Sorry, I misspoke. The
Another way that people react to an apocalypse is by saying, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. So they became libertines. Moral order broke down because people weren't sure that there was going to be a tomorrow to save themselves for, and they weren't sure that God was on their side anymore. So are they entirely sure about heaven in the first place? This developed into a fairly common motif, a way that people sorted themselves societally. It's called the party of the leaf or the party of the flower. If you were a leaf, you would adorn yourselves with figures of leaves. These are on clothes. You'll see them on sword scabbards. You'll see them on borders of armor. If you're a leaf, you plant trees so that they will create shade for your descendants. You've got to make descendants. You're going to be temperate. I don't know that abstinent is the right word, but abstinent to a degree. You're going to be socially conservative. You're going to be building a better tomorrow because you think there will be a tomorrow. You'll be frugal to a certain extent. Like, there are social obligations that you had to carry. Like, there was a demand for franchise among the nobility, so they were expected to conspicuously consume in certain ways, but they weren't going to go into debt to do it. You could expect someone who had the party of the leaf to begin building wealth for their family and improving the family, not just by attempting to raise your social station by putting on airs. By contrast, the party of the flower thought that life was short, and so let's live it while we can. Let's make love where you can find it. Let's eat, drink, party, because who knows how long we're going to live. Let's spend all of the money that you have and whatever you can borrow, because tomorrow's not guaranteed. They were fairly libertine, so you also see flowers patterned on flowers on sword scabbards. What was that about? Like, here we would say, like, oh, is this a matter of sexual identity? No, but it was a matter of social identity. They were identifying with being, I want to say a lover, not a fighter, but that's wrong. They were both. They were identifying themselves with being libertines and hard partiers. Occasionally you see clothing and suits of armor that have both leaves and flowers. That was a choice too. We were saying you were walking the middle path. You didn't hold with the extremes of either side. Or occasionally it was just pretty. On the borders of Europe, there was the White Horse of Conquest. 1299, a Turk named Osman, which is the Turkish variation of the Muslim name Uthman, came with his father's tribe out of what is now Kazakhstan, fleeing Mongol conquest. They settled near Nicaea in northern Anatolia. Now, you've heard of the Nicene Creed? Mm-hmm. There, Nicaea, Nicaea. They pledged loyalty to the Seljuk Turks. His father became a bey, the chieftain. Osman made a name for himself as a brave warrior. They nicknamed him Kara, or the Black, which means northern, which also means tough. In Asia, there's cardinal directions are associated with colors. White is west perspective. Black is north. Blue is east. Red is south. Like, if you hear like Eastern groups associated with colors like the White Huns or the Blue Turks, they're telling you where they're from. But there are also attributes associated with those color directions. Like we even have it today. Like he's very northern, he's very western. There are like personality traits that are associated with living in any of those cardinal directions, right? So same for them. As an adult, Osmond had a religious experience. He dreamed that the branches of his family tree would shadow the whole world. He married the daughter of a famous sheikh. He fought the Byzantines and he took as much of their land as he could. He did not break it down. He wanted to rule it. He didn't want to destroy it. He called himself an emir. His nation was the Ottoman Emirate. Later, his descendants conquered all of Anatolia from the Byzantines, who were helpfully involved in the civil war at the time. He set up a sultanate called the Sultanate of Rome. The Ottomans were very much like the Visigoths, in which they respected and valued Roman Byzantine culture, art, law, traditions. They just wanted to put themselves on top of it. They were very successful at that because they adopted the then unique practice of fostering all of the orphans created by the war. Boys from poor families, they converted them to Islam. They trained them as a standing body of well-paid infantry. These were the Janissaries. They were obliged to serve, so in a way they were captive, kind of like the Mamluk slaves in Egypt. But unlike the Mamluks, they were not eunuchs. And so they were able to have families. And these elite soldiers with high social status and authority were then able to have families of their own, extend their status down to their children, and built up. It was a way for the Turks to swallow the Christian population of Anatolia and integrate them into Turkic society in a way that was accepted by both sides. The Ottomans ran into a slight problem in the 1330s, but they got it off an awful lot easier than the Seljuk Turks elsewhere. That problem was named Timur Beg Gurkhani. He was a Mongol Turk from Uzbekistan. We know him as Tamur the Lame, or Tamerlane. He killed 5% of the world population. He was considered an ally to Europe because he killed the shit out of traditional European enemies. He's called the Scourge of God. A little later on, we'll move out of the era of the apocalypse into the era that recovered from it. Henry V of England, he was the son of a usurper. He was the grandson of the Duke of Lancaster, who was the founder of the House of Lancaster, the younger brother of the Black Prince. He was the great-grandson of Edward III. Henry all but conquered France at Agincourt in 1415. And in later campaigns consolidated the victory. It didn't end at Agincourt, even though Shakespeare would like us to think it did. He was aided by French instability and infighting in the French royal family. It was so bad that the Dauphin, the prince, had his cousin, John the Fearless of Burgundy, murdered in broad daylight on the streets of Paris. Burgundy was the most powerful noble in France, and arguably more powerful than the king, who was subject to bouts of insanity. Because of that murder, his son, Philip the Good, the new duke, became Henry V's most ardent supporter. This was the cause of the alliance between England and Burgundy. Burgundy at that time was all of eastern support Henry's heir to the throne, married into the royal family with Catherine. That should have been the end of it. But Henry died 5 years later, leaving a toddler son to inherit the throne. So the Dauphin decided he did not want to play second fiddle to an English 4-year-old, and he restarted the war, which went badly. He was getting his ass kicked. It was glorious. That guy was a tool. Until a little French girl from Orleans had a vision from God that told her to reconquer France from the English. Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. The Maid of Orleans was spoken to by God, or at least she and half of France, and no, 2/3 of France, and half of the rest of Europe thought she had been. She did indeed conquer France back from the English in the name of God and her king. But despite her death, because she was burned at the stake when the Burgundians captured her and managed to have her declared a heretic, which was difficult because although Joan was very uneducated, her theology was actually quite good. She was a staunch and loyal daughter of the church, and she was perfectly prepared to go to war against those who were not. Like, all the way over in Hungary, the followers of Jan Hus. Jan Hus was a Hungarian priest and an advocate of reform in the church. He condemned the corruption of priests, prelates, so like bishops and cardinals, even the Pope. He also advocated serving community to the laity, which was not done at that time. It was a big deal because there was no question in people's minds that the Eucharist was the literal body and blood of Jesus Christ, and you do not offer that to anyone who doesn't appreciate what's going on. So the priest would receive communion on behalf of the populace, and with his priestly authority would forgive their sins through the rite of confession. So Eucharist was not offered to the laity, and Jan Hus thought that it ought to be. Unfortunately for him and for Hungary, he was also a heretic. It was not a great heresy, but he did believe some fringe things, and that was used to discredit him generally. But he was very loved in Hungary, and it was not a huge heresy or a dangerous heresy. Nevertheless, they burned him at the stake. In response, the people and nobles of Hungary took up arms and threw out their temporal and spiritual overlords and established what was essentially the first Protestant kingdom. This did not go over well with the ousted overlords, including their king, Sigismund, who had just defeated an Ottoman invasion with the help of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. He had just defended all of Eastern Europe from Ottoman incursion, so it seems a little ungrateful. In response, the overlords declared a crusade, 3 of them, in fact. The reason there were 3 is because the Hungarians kicked ass. They had generals like Jan Žižka, who was called Old One Eye, who was a veteran of the war with the Polish and Lithuanians against the Teutonic Knights, that saw the Teutonic Knights broken as a major European power. He understood how to fight cavalry, and so he instituted the system of wagenburgs, or wagon castles, a mobile fortress of armored wagons filled with crossbowmen and burly peasants with 2-handed flails. They slaughtered every army that came up against them, and he and his followers started calling themselves Tatarites. They set up a commune, and they dedicated themselves to establishing the equality of man and killing all nobles. And the nobles who were on their side went, "Wait, what?" And the Tatarites were like, "You heard us." So the revolution fell apart, the nobles changed sides, they killed all the commies in the next crusade, the king got his country back, the Hungarians were allowed to take communion. The rest of Europe learned to walk softly around Hungary for a generation or two. Takeaway is never kill the reformers, because then you're left with radicals. Things that go on in Hungary, Poland, Romania, also Bohemia, Wallachia, then totally swallowed by the Ottoman Empire. They seem like a sideshow to the narratives of Western and Northern Europe, because there's no clear story to follow. The Western Europeans thought so also. Nation states over in Eastern Europe rose and fell over the course of every 50 years. But I guess they would follow like the course of a individual powerful person's life course. And then when that person died, there was almost no one there to pick up the pieces, and so the country falls apart along with the death of the powerful individual. But this one, the Hussite Rebellion, was such a big deal that Joan of Arc wrote a letter to Jan Žižka and said, "Y'all better get right with the church, because and also take your king and nobles back, because if you don't, if I ever get a break from the English wars," they called them the English wars, I'm coming over there, I'm raising an army, and I'll make holy war on your ass. We actually have that letter. It's pretty cool. But we don't think Joan was literate, so it was almost certainly dictation. But the letter is so blunt and direct that it is almost certainly an actual dictation of what that young peasant girl actually said and sent to a noble general, because it was shockingly direct. We would consider it like very readable. It was very plain spoken by our standards. It was not flowery at all. But of course, Joan died before that could ever happen. But the Hungarians remembered it. And so for the rest of the 15th century, they were allies of England against France. And so were the Burgundians. So the Dauphin, who later became the thoroughly forgettable Charles VII, may have reclaimed France after Joan handed it to him on a platter. But Philip the Good did not forget that he'd had his father murdered. So while the English were losing their hold on France, he consolidated power in Burgundy. He set up borders and essentially became his own little country. He declared himself the Grand Duke under his own authority. To establish his legitimacy in the eyes of his peers, this court very quickly became the most opulent, magnificent, well-respected in Europe. The fashions of Burgundy set the fashions all over Europe.
Is he the one who was chasing around the Holy Roman Emperor with a crown in his saddlebags, to get declared the heir to the Holy Roman Empire?
That was his son.
That was his son. Okay, he was one of them.
Yeah. Philip the Good reigned for 48 years. Under his influence, Burgundy became staggeringly prosperous and one of the most wealthy states in Europe. That is something that the modern world will never experience. The stability and constancy of a monarch. A bad monarch can destroy a country, but a good monarch can shepherd prosperity in ways that would never be possible in a democracy. 48 years is a long time, but he, Philip the Good, had other contemporaries who reigned just as long or longer. The Holy Roman Emperor at the time, Frederick III, was on the throne for 53 years. They called him Frederick the Peaceful because he discovered early on in his life that he was not good at fighting wars. His first war was against his brother Albert, who was very active and ambitious, whereas Frederick was patient and methodical. They fought for 4 years, and Albert won every battle. So Frederick let him have everything that he wanted. Albert died a year later, childless, and Frederick inherited everything that he had and more. got used to a habit out of outliving his enemies and picking up their pieces. He assumed so many territories that way that he was forced to move his royal court from city to city. Like, that had been, itinerant courts had been a thing 200 years earlier. But by this time, there were royal capitals, and business of state was expected to be conducted in the capital city. But Frederick's territory was so large that that was impossible, and he had to go back to the itinerant court model of like Richard the Lion-Hearted here in the 15th century. The years of peace and quiet victories made the Holy Roman Empire tremendously prosperous and made Frederick an immovable feature of the European landscape. But it wasn't like he had no conflicts at all. He did, and some of them were against Philip the Good. They were over the Duchy of Savoy, which is a border border territory between France and Germany. It had been part of the empire. Philip integrated it into Burgundy. There were a few sieges back and forth. The last time they fought, Frederick went big enough that he forced Philip to promise the hand of his daughter Mary to his son Maximilian, who would later be called the Last Knight. It was one of the happy accidents of European dynastic history. It was purely a political marriage. It was uniting two powerful states, but it turned into one of the great love matches of European history. Mary and Maximilian adored each other. And for almost 10 years, they did everything together. They wrote letters together, they read together, they went hunting together, they went touring their lands together, they administered their lands together. They were inseparable. And then Mary died when she was out hunting with her husband. The horse reared and she was thrown, and the horse fell and pinned her underneath it. She took 3 days to die, and Maximilian mourned her for the rest of his life. They had a son named Philip, after his grandfather, Philip the Good, who was the heir to all Burgundy. He was the heir to Burgundy because his uncle, Charles the Bold, had rekindled his father's sporadic war against the French crown. He blazed a trail across half of France. He was a brilliant soldier, he was a brilliant administrator, but a poor judge of character. His allies betrayed him on the battlefield. He was attacked from two directions and died in battle. This was one of the pivotal moments of the 15th century. All of the things that did not happen because Charles the Bold died young and childless. Very likely France and England would have been a united kingdom again had Charles lived. But we'll never know, because the death of Charles put an abrupt end to any further possibility of English campaigns in France. You see, while Philip the Good was reigning wisely and more or less peacefully in Europe, in Burgundy, the English were tearing themselves apart under the son of Henry V. Henry VI was spineless, sickly, and occasionally insane. He had inherited the Bourbon propensity to madness from his mother. The great lords of state, primarily his cousin Richard of York, administered the realm capably in his periods of incapacity. But then, when Henry would recover from his madness, in order to reassert his manhood, he would immediately undo everything that his administrators had done in his incapacity. And then he would fall into madness again. Richard of York, who had a strong claim to the throne in his own right, finally had enough and declared himself king. Richard died in battle. His army was destroyed. His second eldest son, Edmund, was executed after the battle by his own cousin. The eldest son, Edward, gathered the remnants of his father's Yorkist forces, defeated the Lancastrians in open battle, deposed the king, and was crowned Edward IV at the age of 19. Edward IV was the tallest English king at 6'4". He was famous for tremendous feats of strength on and off the field. He was unquestionably the most successful battle commander of any English monarch, even surpassing the records of Edward Longshanks or Richard Coeur de Lion. He was deposed through treachery by his uncle in 1470. He retook the throne by the sword a year later. He campaigned successfully in France, although the purpose of those campaigns was more to extort money from the French crown than it was after any serious pursuit of the throne. Edward may have entertained notions of serious pursuit of the French crown. After all, he was never defeated in battle. But then Charles the Bold died, and when Burgundy was inherited by Mary and Maximilian, they were German. There was no family connection anymore. Edward died young at 41, which was widely attributed to an unhealthy lifestyle of too much drink and too many women. About a month after his death, a scandal came out that he in fact married one too many women, which made his public marriage illegitimate and made bastards of children. At least that was the story. Given the famous womanizing, it was probably true. But Richard III took the throne. Richard was a capable general, very capable administrator, loved in the north, but not in the south. He had made enemies of too many people. After several assassination attempts, the French crown decided it was good policy to eliminate the last descendant that could claim a title to the French throne. And so they funded the invasion attempt of an elite Lancastrian who did not have any ties to France, named Henry Tudor. Richard died in battle at Bosworth, leading a cavalry charge that took 3 yards from Henry Tudor himself. Henry Tudor was crowned Henry VII. He married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward, and then he declared Richard III usurper, which took brass. Usurper declares the previous king a usurper. And then systematically executed every male member of the Plantagenet line, which neatly secured his position. He was greedy, he was capricious, he had little respect for the law, but by the time that he was done, there was no one else to fight, so England finally had peace. Gosh, I could talk about this for hours, and I do have more, but we're nearing the end of our class. So I hope that telling these stories gives you an idea of where your persona places themselves in history. Sees their people group and where their people group feels like their place is in history, where they see others in history and what they would have thought. Because I think that is a missing component of a lot of our reenactment. We engage with clothes, we engage with weapons, we engage with fighting styles, but very rarely do we engage with the thoughts and the politics and the history of the things that we're actually recreating. So I hope this was in some way helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir.